Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Old Iron Lungs, and you are tuned in to another episode of the Trench Lines. Today's episode, we will be discussing power, unlimited power, untapped, unattainable power. Today's episode won't be about power. It will be about spars. What is spars? You ask yourself. Well, not SARS. We're not talking about SARS here. We are talking about spars. SPARS is this futuristic scenario for public health risk communicators. You probably have never heard of this at all. Most people have not. Well, this was published by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health and Security back in 2007. Go figure. Why is this so relevant? Well, this has a lot of stark parallels to reality. It's pretty beefy document, 80 pages. When you dive into this thing, it's pretty crazy. They make it convenient with a timeline at the end. It's basically how to prepare in the event that there was a global pandemic. Seems very suspicious that this thing was made before a pandemic came about. The target year was for 2025 through 2028. It's actually astonishing what they talk about in this thing, because there's just so many stark parallels to reality. I will dive into a little bit about the purpose, which they state here in the beginning. A link also for this will be in the description below, so please feel free to go and read it yourself and see this madness for yourself, because it is a little maddening. So yeah, I'll dive into what the purpose of this was, then we'll do the timeline, and that's really it, because if I do anything more, this is going to turn into like an hour and a half bore fest of me reading this document, which these documents are very boring to read and go over. So I will start with the scenario purpose. The following narrative comprised a futuristic scenario to illustrate communication dilemmas concerning medical countermeasures that could plausibly emerge in the not-so-distant future. Its purpose is to prompt users, both individually and in discussion with others, to imagine the dynamics and oftentimes conflicted circumstances in which communication around emergency MCMs, development, distribution, and uptake can take place. While engaged with a rigorous stimulated health emergency, scenario readers have the opportunity to mentally rehearse response while also weighing in the implications of actions. At the same time, readers have the chance to consider what potential measures implemented in today's environment might adversely compare to dilemmas and the class of dilemmas in the future. So they kind of state it right there. It's a futuristic scenario. But is it a scenario? Is it? As I say, question everything. The time frame, like I said, in this scenario is 2025 to 2028. You can do your own comparisons in reality, because there is a lot of those. And it also goes into before the time frame was selected first, two major socioeconomic, demographic, technological, and environmental trends likely to have emerged by that period, which are one, various degrees of access to information technology, which is very prevalent with such easy access to the internet nowadays, and two, varying levels of fragmentation among population along political, social, religious, ideological, and cultural lines. So They're saying that there has to be some divide, which there's more than enough divide these days, and that there has to be access to technology very easily. And then it goes into the environment, so I'll dabble in that a little bit. In the year 2025, the world has become simultaneously more connected, yet divided. Nearly universal access to wireless internet and new technologies, including internet access technology (IAT), thin, flexible screens that can temporarily be attached to briefcases, backpacks, clothing, and used to stream content from the internet, has provided a means for readily shared news and information. There you go, like they said before, easy access to internet information. However, many of the chosen have self-restricted their sources that they turn to for information, often electing to only interact with those whom they agree with. And in this this thing, they call it what's the term? Echo chamber. Yeah. Well. Blah, 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 blah. From a government standpoint, the current administration, led by Randall Archer, who took office in 2025, served as the vice president under Jacqueline Bennett, who did not seek a second term due to health concerns. The two remain close, and Bennett acts as a close confidant under the unofficial advisor, President Archer. The majority of President Archer's senior staff includes Health Department and Human Services. Dr. Nigel are carried over from Bennett's administration at the time of the SPARS outbreak. Nigel served in this position for over 3 years. So there's another parallel to reality about, a current president who was the vice president to a past president. I'm going to go into the scenario organization use. The scenario was designed to illustrate public health risk communication challenges associated with distributing the emergency medical countermeasures during an infectious disease pandemic. The story is organized in chronological order, and each chapter concludes with a treatment of consultation communication dilemmas for the corresponding discussions and questions. Some questions are targeted towards those with the risk factor represented by federal agencies, while others address issues more relevant to state and local risk communicators. So, what that's saying is every chapter, they go over it with a couple of questions to help guide these peoples during these times of risk communications. I'll go over the table of contents just for context. There's 19 chapters in this lovely document. Chapter 1, the SPARS outbreak begins. Chapter 2, a possible cure. Chapter 3, a potential vaccine. Chapter 4, user beware. Chapter 5, going viral. Chapter 6, the grass is always greener. Chapter 7, the voice. Chapter 8, are you talking to me? Chapter 9, changing horse midstream. Chapter 10, head of line privileges. Chapter 11, standing in line and protesting online. Chapter 12, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Chapter 13, lovers and haters. Chapter 14, the grass is always greener, part 2. Chapter 15, are you talking to me, part 2. Chapter 16, anybody ho. Chapter 17 is in the recovery section, vaccine recovery. Chapter 18, acknowledging loss. And Chapter 19, SPARS aftermath. So, that's the table of contents. It goes into the beginning how their SPARS is the St. Paul Chronicle respiratory disease, and that's how I got the name of this. But we will dive into the timeline. So yeah, like they said earlier, this timeline is in chronological order from 2025 to the end of, I think, 2028. And yeah, this is some, some conspiratorial stuff here, pal. October, the first U.S. death occurred during the SPARS Initially, these deaths were thought to be from something else. My printer ran out there, sorry. In November, cases of SPARS were reported across Minnesota and 6 other states. Thanksgiving, holidays, travel, and Black Friday shopping facilitated spread of SPARS beyond the Midwest. 26 states, multiple other countries. By mid-December, the World Health Organization declared SPARS a pandemic to be a health emergency international crisis. December, no treatment or vaccine for SPARS existed, but there was some evidence that the antiviral Calvacir could be effective as a therapeutic. A vaccine development manufacturer by a multinational livestock conglomerate, GMI, was proposed as a potential foundation for the human vaccine. The vaccine was developed to combat the outbreak of a similar respiratory coronavirus in hoofed mammal populations in Southeast Asia, but the vaccine had not yet been licensed by any regulatory authority or tested on human beings, and there were concerns over the potential long-term effects. In January of 2026, the United States government contracted SynBio to develop and produce a human SPARS vaccine based on the GMI animal vaccine. The HHS Secretary invoked the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, PrEP Act, to provide liability shield and protection for the vaccine manufacturers and provide Congress authorization to appropriate emergency funds under the PrEP Act to provide compensation for potential adverse side effects from the vaccine, which I believe that happened in reality. Following reports of Calvacir's limited success in treating patients with severe SPARS infection, the FDA issued an emergency authorization for the antiviral Calvacir and had been evaluated as a therapeutic for SPARS in MERS, and several million doses were maintained in the SNS, which could be developed as necessary while production capability was established to meet the demand. So as you see, I believe that parallels to, there's a different medical term for what was used in reality, but there was, I don't know if it was hydrochloroquine, or I don't know the name off the top of my head, but like I said, there's a lot of parallels to reality. Have you just changed some fine details around in this piece of madness that I'm reading. It continues, 2026 January, the FDA, the CDC, the NIH provide seemingly conflicting communication regarding the safety and the effectiveness of Calvacir. In the United States, public anxiety around SPARS resulted in extensive use of Calvacir, frequent self-reports of SPARS symptoms, and the surge in demand for the medical care. By late January, SPARS was detected in 42 countries and all of the United States. The lack of cultural trust in the FDA and other government communications became apparent amongst various ethnic groups in the United States. A video of a 3-year-old vomiting, fainting after taking a dose of Calvacir was widely and rapidly spread via social media, strengthening the opposition of the EUA. There's the power. That was in March. The UK Medicine and Healthcare Product Regulatory Agency and the European Medicine Agency jointly authorized the emergency use of a new antiviral, VMAX, in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe. Some Americans attempted to gain access to VMAX online or by traveling to Europe. In April of 2026, the CDC publicized an updated and significantly lower case fatality rate in the United States. The perception of less risk triggered a drop in public interest, as it would naturally. If it's not that risky, just like if the flu's out there, it might kill some people who are at risk, but it's not a plague. May, production of Corvax, the SPARS vaccine produced by SynBio, was well underway. Federal agencies initiated communication campaigns using a well-known public figure with mixed response. Polls indicated around 15 to 23 increase in SPARS and Calvasier knowledge nationwide. Hip-hop icon BZ successfully promoted public health messaging with an online video, but he lost some credibility when he tried to compare the volunteers of Corvax trials with the volunteers from the Tuskegee studies. Yeah, studies. Similarly, former President Bennett provided a non-committal response when asked if she would want Calvasier for her grandchildren. That president, her. We continue in May. Public health agencies discovered that a relatively new social media platform, Unqual, was being used as a primary means of communication in a college-age population. June, Corvax entered its final stages of its expedited review. Expedited review. A product capacity was increased. 10,000 doses were expected to be available by July, with 50 million more in August. Such good production. The CDC Advisory Committee of Immunization Practices announced vaccine priority groups. Health care providers were not included as the priority, and this drove them mad, as it did in reality, inciting protests by doctors and nurses across the country. In order to prioritize distribution of the limited Corvax supply, the federal government requested the states report summary informations of patients' electronic health records to estimate the number of individuals in high-risk population. This effort was met with resistance from the public, who protested the federal government's access to their private medical information. Interesting. A week prior to initializing the nationwide vaccination program, damage to a power grid in the Pacific Northwest resulted in widespread power outages that lasted 2 weeks. State and local public health agencies initiated communication programs using posters and flyers to promote the vaccination program in the absence of electronic media. Social media's efforts across the country to promote the vaccination campaign and crowd-sourced data helped increase efficiency in distributing the vaccine. Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. August of 2026. The Corvax vaccination program met resistance from several groups: alternative medical proponents, Muslims, African Americans, and anti-vaccination activists. Initially operating independently, these groups banded together via social media to increase their influence to the maximum power. September of 2026, Japan announced that it would not be approving Corvax for use in Japan in favor of developing and producing its own vaccine. I'm pretty sure this happened in reality too. October. College students, predominantly on the East and the West Coast, stage protest against unequal global availability of Corvax. Vaccination rates amongst these students were below average for college students in other areas of the country. November of 2026, the anti-vaxxation movement formed in the wake of the 2015 measles outbreak in the United States reignited their efforts to combat the anti-vaccination supergroup. Yes, it was a battle of anti-vaxxers and anti-vaxxers in a nice clash of verbal exchange. The FDA and the CDC and other federal agencies also doubted their communication efforts to promote the CORVAX campaign, and an increased number of post-SPARS pneumonia cases were reported across the country. I'm pretty sure I just read something about that a week or two ago. In December, the nationwide vaccination program was expanded beyond its initial priority population to include the rest of the country. Federal agencies initiated vaccination programs invoking target online advertisements, which we know that they are targeting certain groups. In February of 2027, post-SPARS pneumonia cases stressed inventory of antibodies across the country. The HHS Secretary authorized distribution of the oldest lot of antibodies from the SNS to supply the antibody supply nationwide. Tests of the antibodies in the SNS inventory determined that 94% of the remaining antibodies in the oldest lot maintained sufficient potency. Tests conducted in August of 2026 provided the basis for extending the expiration of these lots from 2027 to 2029. In March of 2027, rumors spread via traditional and social media that the government was dispensing expired antibodies. How dare them? Alyssa, a leader in the natural medicine movement, sought out medical care at an emergency department after natural remedies failed to resolve her son's bacterial pneumonia. After successful treatment with the proper antibodies from the SNS supply, she touted the benefits of the expired antibodies in her social media circles. We'll see if that happens. Is it communication dilemmas? Communication dilemmas. Then it goes from the response scenario timeline into the recovery. 2027 of April. Crowdsourced and independent analysis of CORVAX side effects conflicted with official federal response and reports. The independent analyses gained popularity in the traditional and social media outlets due to its visual presentation and its interactive content. Government attempted to respond to this with data and press releases, but they largely failed. And this is in the recovery scenario timeline, which is immediately followed. In May of 2027, reports of CORVAX side effects began to gain traction. Several parents of children who experienced neurological symptoms after receiving the vaccination sued the federal government and SynBio. But the lawsuits were dropped when they learned of the compensation funds available through the PrEP Act and the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Trust Fund. In November, initial reports of long-term side effects of CORVAX vaccine emerged. These reports arose primarily from those in the initial priority high-risk population and were reported few in number, with little available data and numerous pre-existing conditions. Initial studies were unable to identify a statistically significant association with any long-term effect. Claims for compensation were placed on indefinite hold until further data could be gathered and analysis was completed. So you get the side effect, it's extremely adverse, and you won't even be compensated. In response to public demand for long-term side effect compensation, the HHS Secretary invited Congress to conduct an independent investigation of the federal compensation proceeds to alleviate the concerns of the citizens. The public and the media pressured Congress to increase the funds authorized for the compensation under PrEP Act. Inside of this actual document, if you read it, there's much more meat to all of these timelines. There's a lot more. And then it just says in August, the SPARS pandemic was in August of 2028. It was declared to be over. However, experts remain concerned about domestic animal reservoirs and the potential for future outbreaks. And the reason why they're stating that is because in this scenario, they claim that it was an animal that brought about this SPARS. And they say that the conspiracy theorists will claim it's from a lab, an escaped virus from a lab. Those gosh darn conspiracy theorists, always got those wild thoughts on their mind. I believe if you were to dive into this, I believe we're around page 50. So, if you would like to bore yourself half to death with something that's extremely important, I would suggest you read this for yourself. There's a link in the description below. I think that this thing is eerily similar to how things have played out. And we'll see if more pneumonia cases break out, if there's somehow all of a sudden a shortage in antibodies, the long-term side effects, especially with the children developing neurological side effects, which I pray that doesn't actually happen in reality. So we will keep our fingers crossed that none of that happens, but I hate to say that I think it's gonna, but I think it's gonna happen. You know, old Iron Lungs, I have the motto, question everything. Always question. To gain a better understanding, you must question things. So that's why I'm here, to question, why is this so familiar to reality? Why was this even written? They really need to write something like this? Like this? I understand if you want to create communication in the event that there was an actual plague out there, not just a spooky virus that scares everybody. So, I don't know why they would go to this length with this many stark comparisons to reality. But, you know, I am just a regular old peasant, and they run the world. But until then, I will be here in the trench lines. I hope you grab a shovel and dig in, because we ain't going nowhere. I'll see you in the next trench.